The arrangement was, in essence, a promise sealed in flesh. A human woman, given to the ageless court of the vampire king, a living treaty to quell a century of bloodshed along the borderlands. It was a grand, theatrical gesture of peace, and Alara was the grand, theatrical prop. She was meant to be a symbol of a new era, a bridge between two peoples who had forgotten everything but the taste of each other's enmity. But a symbol, she was learning, was a lonely thing to be. Tonight, the great hall of the Onyx Keep was a river of dark silks and pale, predatory grace. Laughter, thin and sharp as splintered ice, echoed up to the vaulted ceilings where shadows clung like ancient moss. From her place on a secluded marble balcony overlooking the throng, Alara felt less like a guest of honor and more like an exhibit. She had been presented, her hand brushed by the cold lips of the king, Kaelin, and then largely forgotten as the true life of the court. A nocturnal, intricate dance of power and veiled threat resumed around her. She had retreated to this alcove, a small, carved space of relative privacy, a ship's mast in a churning sea. The cold of the stone railing seeped through the fine wool of her gown, a chilling reminder of where she was. 6 days now. 6 days of feeling like a songbird in a cage of obsidian. Below, the court moved with the lethal elegance of a pack of wolves. They were beautiful, all of them, with faces carved from alabaster and eyes that held the deep, star-dusted darkness of a moonless night. And at their center, a vortex of still, absolute power, was Kaelin. He was not like the others. Where they were sharp, he was solid. Where they were a flurry of movement, he was an anchor of stillness. He stood with his back to a massive, unlit hearth, speaking with 2 of his elder advisors, their silver-gray hair a stark contrast to his own eternal black. The firelight from 100 torches caught the rubies on his tunic, making them glitter like fresh droplets of blood. She watched him, as she had been watching him for 6 days. He was the architect of this peace, and the warden of her new life. He was a creature of impossible age, his presence so immense it felt as if he displaced the very air around him. When he looked at her, which was rarely, his eyes, the color of faded violets, a strange and disconcerting hue, held a profound, weary disinterest. It wasn't malice. It was something worse. It was indifference. She was a duty, a political necessity. A piece on a board so vast she couldn't even glimpse its edges. The music swelled, a haunting melody played on strings of gut and silver, and the voices in the hall rose with it. But his voice, when he spoke, cut through the din. It was not loud, but it carried a resonance, a timbre that commanded attention, that vibrated in the very stone of the keep. She had learned to isolate the sound of it. Lord Valerus, a vampire whose face was a mask of desiccated cruelty, gestured vaguely in her direction. Alara instinctively drew back further into the shadows of the balcony, her heart giving a painful lurch. They were speaking of her. The council is unsettled, my king, Valerus said, his tone a silken insinuation. They question the wisdom of bringing one of them into the heart of the keep. Her blood. Kaelin shifted his weight, a minute adjustment that nonetheless drew every eye in their small circle. He lifted a goblet to his lips, the polished silver a mirror for the flickering torchlight. He did not look up at her balcony. He did not need to. Her blood is common, Kaelin stated. The words were not angry, not heated. They were a simple, indisputable fact, delivered with the flat finality of a judge's sentence. It is thin. Unremarkable. A glass of water next to a cask of aged wine. A quiet, cruel chuckle from the second advisor, a woman named Serafina, with eyes like chips of obsidian. An apt comparison, Your Majesty, Valerus purred. But the symbolism. The symbolism is for the mortals, Kaelin interrupted, his voice dropping lower, yet losing none of its carrying power. It found Alara in her shadowed alcove and wrapped around her like a chain. Let them believe this gesture holds weight. Let them sleep soundly, believing their daughter is a cherished guest. He took a slow sip from his goblet. The silence stretched. In truth, her presence is an embarrassment. A constant, breathing reminder of the compromises we have been forced to make. But it is a necessary 1 inch. Embarrassment. The word was not a shout. It was a whisper. A perfectly aimed dart that flew up through the music and the laughter and the clinking of silver on crystal and found its home deep in Alara's chest. It was a quiet, precise, devastating blow. A glass of water. Common blood. An embarrassment. Her breath caught, a tiny, sharp sound that was swallowed by the cavernous space. The cold of the marble railing was no longer just a chill, it was a deep, invasive ache that seemed to be freezing her from the inside out. Her hands, which had been resting on the stone, curled into fists, her nails digging into her palms. She felt 100 pairs of unseen eyes on her, though she knew no one was looking. The shame was a physical heat, a blush that spread from her neck to the roots of her hair. He had not been speaking to her, but he had been speaking of her, and in doing so, he had rendered her utterly, completely naked. He had stripped away the fine gown, the title of honored guest, the pretense of the peace treaty, and left her standing as what he truly saw, a base, common thing. A necessary inconvenience. She could not breathe. The air, thick with the scent of beeswax, cloying perfume, and something else, something metallic and predatory, felt too heavy to draw into her lungs. She had to leave. Now. Before the force of his casual contempt shattered the fragile composure she had so carefully constructed. She backed away from the railing, her movements stiff and clumsy. She felt like a fawn trapped in the gaze of a serpent, even though his back was still to her. His presence was a weight on her skin. Turning, she fled the balcony, her soft-soled shoes making no sound on the polished stone. She moved through the darkened upper corridors, a ghost in a borrowed palace. The portraits of his ancestors, pale and severe, watched her flight with judgmental eyes. Each footstep was a lifetime. Each beat of her heart was the hammering of a nail into the coffin of the hope she hadn't even known she was carrying. She reached the heavy oak doors of her assigned chambers and pushed them open, stumbling inside. The room was a study in opulence, with silks draping the canopied bed and a fire crackling in the hearth. It was meant to be a comfort, a sign of her value. But now, it felt like a mockery, a gilded cage for an embarrassing specimen. She did not light the extra candles. She stood in the center of the vast room, wrapped in the encroaching darkness, the firelight casting long, dancing shadows that writhed on the walls like tormented spirits. The sounds of the party below were a distant, muffled pulse. But the king's voice was here, in the room with her, as clear as if he stood beside her. An embarrassment. The word echoed in the sudden, crushing silence of her solitude. It did not fade. It settled, taking root in the fertile ground of her loneliness, and began to grow. She wrapped her arms around herself, but it offered no warmth. She was alone, in the heart of an enemy court, with a king who saw her as a shame. And in that moment, something inside her, something soft and hopeful, quietly broke. The pieces fell away, and what was left was hard, and cold, and still. Kalen felt the subtle shift in the room's atmosphere before he consciously registered a reason for it. The thrum of courtly life continued unabated, the whispers, the rustle of velvet, the low throb of the string quartet, but a single, minute thread had been snipped from the tapestry. He dismissed the feeling as weariness. These mortals, with their fleeting passions and their noisy, fragile bodies, had tired him for centuries. This new piece, brokered on the back of their fear and his own pragmatism, was the most exhausting venture of all. She seems withdrawn, Serafina noted, her gaze flicking for a fraction of a second toward the now empty balcony. Her observation was a stone dropped into a still pond, the ripples spreading outward. She is in a strange place, surrounded by strangers, Kalen replied, his tone dismissive. He drained his goblet and set it down with a soft click on a passing servant's tray. The liquid within had been wine, a deep, cloying red from the southern human vineyards, a political courtesy he found increasingly tiresome. The real sustenance would come later, in private. It is to be expected. She will acclimate. Valerus's smile was a thin, unpleasant curve. Or she will break. They are not known for their resilience. She need only be resilient enough to breathe, Kalen said, his voice clipped. His patience with Valerus's constant provocations was wearing thin. Her function is to exist. To be seen. Nothing more is required. He turned his attention back to the pressing matters of statecraft, the reports of troop movements along the eastern passes, the the squabbles of the lesser vampire houses. The human girl, Elara, was a minor detail, a logistical footnote in the grand, ancient text of his reign. He had said what he had said because it was the truth as he saw it, and because it was necessary to placate the more traditionalist factions of his court, to reassure them that this alliance had not softened him. He had not considered that she might hear. He had not considered her at all. The night wore on. The moon, a sliver of bone-white crescent, climbed the sky outside the tall, arched windows. He held court, dispensing judgments with an economy of word and gesture that had been perfected over 1,000 years. He listened to petitions, settled disputes, and maintained the delicate balance of power that kept his kingdom from devouring itself. Through it all, the vague sense of something amiss persisted, a low hum beneath the surface of his thoughts. It was the feeling of a misplaced book, a discordant note in a familiar symphony. It was the empty space on the balcony. It was not until the early hours of the morning, when the guests were beginning to disperse like smoke and the torches were burning low, that the matter was brought to his direct attention. A human servant, one of the few brought with Elara's retinue, approached him, her head bowed so low her chin nearly touched her chest. She trembled, a leaf in the wind. "Your Majesty," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "The Lady Elara, she has retired for the night. She feels unwell." Kaelin looked down at the terrified woman. Unwell. It was a convenient, nebulous human ailment. A headache, a fit of melancholy, a fabricated excuse. "Unwell how?" he asked, his voice flat. She did not say, "Your Majesty." She has locked her door and instructed that she is not to be disturbed. A flicker of annoyance. This was not part of the arrangement. Her role was to be present, a visible testament to the treaty. Her hiding away in her chambers was a complication. "See that she is attended to," he commanded, already turning away. "If she requires a physician, one will be provided." "Yes, Your Majesty." The servant scurried away, relieved to be dismissed. Kaelin strode from the great hall, his black cloak sweeping behind him. The corridors were quieter now, the shadows deeper. His thoughts were already moving on to the more significant challenges of the coming day. A human girl's fleeting indisposition was of no consequence. She would recover. She would attend the next banquet, sit in her designated chair, and play her part. He had no reason to believe otherwise. Yet, as he ascended the grand staircase toward his own private tower, the image of the empty balcony returned to him. He remembered the brief glimpse he'd had of her when she'd first stepped out onto it, a small figure in a deep blue gown, her brown hair a stark, earthy contrast to the pale stone. She had looked fragile, breakable. He had dismissed the thought then, as he dismissed it now. Fragility was a liability he could not afford to entertain, in himself or in others. Especially not in a political pawn. He reached his chambers, the silence within a welcome reprieve. He had ruled for centuries by understanding one fundamental principle: emotions were a weakness. They were a human failing, a fire that consumed from within. He had long ago extinguished his own. He felt nothing for the girl. Annoyance, perhaps. A sliver of impatience. But nothing more. The disquiet he felt was merely a reaction to a disruption of his plans. He was certain of it. The first day of Elara's absence was a study in silence. She did not answer the soft knocks on her door, not from her own maid, nor from the court physician Kaelin had dispatched as a perfunctory gesture. Through the heavy oak, she simply stated that she required only rest, her voice calm and even, betraying none of the tempest that had raged within her the night before. The storm had passed, leaving behind a strange and desolate landscape, a quiet resolve as hard and unyielding as the granite of the keep itself. She did not weep. The shame had burned away the tears. Instead, a cold clarity had settled upon her. She was a thing. A symbol. An embarrassment. Very well. A thing did not need to perform. A symbol could be potent in its absence. And an embarrassment was best kept out of sight. Her withdrawal was not a surrender, it was the only act of defiance available to her. She would not grant them the spectacle of her presence. She would not sit at their table and pretend she was anything other than what their king had named her. Her chambers, which had felt like a cage, now became her world. She explored them not as a prisoner, but as a castaway exploring her island. They were a suite of 3 rooms, the grand bedchamber, a sitting room with a cold fireplace, and a bathing chamber with a deep copper tub. And, tucked away behind a tapestry depicting a grim, ancient battle, she found a small, circular room she hadn't noticed before. It was a library. Dust motes danced in the single shaft of light filtering through a high, narrow window. The room smelled of aging paper, leather, and time itself. The shelves were carved into the stone walls, crammed with books bound in dark, cracked hides. These were not the gilded, decorative tomes of the main castle library. These were older, forgotten volumes. Histories, collections of folklore, treatises on celestial mechanics, atlases of lands that no longer existed. It was a repository of lost knowledge, a dusty sanctuary. She ran her fingers along the spines, the rough leather a comfort to her touch. Here was something real. Something that did not judge. She pulled a heavy volume from a shelf. The Annals of the First Kings. The script was archaic, the ink faded, but it was legible. She settled into a worn leather chair, the book open in her lap, and began to read. The world outside her door, the world of pale predators and their contemptuous king, faded away. The silence of the room was a balm, the weight of the book in her hands an anchor. Meanwhile, Kaelin's day proceeded with its usual metronomic precision. He met with his war council, reviewed patrol reports, and dictated letters to the human lords, his words a careful blend of reassurance and veiled threat. The girl's absence was a minor, irritating hum at the edge of his awareness. A vacant chair at the midday meal, a meal he did not partake in but always presided over. His court noticed. A few subtle glances were exchanged. A whispered question here and there. Is the human guest still unwell? She is resting, was the official reply, delivered by his seneschal with practiced impassivity. Kaelin found the whispers irritating. They were a distraction. Her absence was creating more talk than her presence had. It was an unforeseen consequence, a miscalculation. He had assumed she would be eager to please, desperate for acceptance. This quiet, stubborn refusal was unexpected. In the late afternoon, as twilight bled across the sky, staining the clouds purple and grey, Valerus approached him in the map room. The older vampire was examining a chart of the contested borderlands, his long fingers tracing the jagged line of the mountains. The human remains in her cage, Valerus observed, not looking up. She is in her chambers, Kaelin corrected, his voice sharp. And she is not a prisoner. Is she not? Valerus finally turned, a faint, knowing smile on his lips. She is 1,000 miles from her home, surrounded by creatures who could extinguish her life with a thought. Her door may not be locked from the outside, but it is a cage nonetheless. He paused, letting the silence hang in the air. Her continued seclusion is becoming conspicuous. The court is beginning to believe she has taken some offense. That perhaps the king's hospitality is not as gracious as it appears. The insinuation was clear. Her absence was reflecting on him. It was a stain on his authority, a suggestion that he could not manage one lone, common human. The annoyance Kaelin felt began to curdle into something sharper. She is a girl, prone to fits of fancy, Kaelin said, his eyes fixed on the map, refusing to meet Valerus's gaze. Her moods are of no concern. Perhaps, Valerus conceded, his voice smooth as oil. But a perceived slight to a living treaty can be as damaging as a broken promise. The humans are sentimental. If they believe their precious offering is unhappy, it could unravel all your careful work. Kaelin's jaw tightened. Valerus was right. The situation had escalated from a personal matter, if it could even be called that, to a political one. Her feelings were irrelevant, but the perception of her feelings had become a strategic liability. He had wanted her to be an invisible symbol. Instead, her invisibility was making her the center of attention. He would have to deal with it. He would go to her chambers. He would remind her of her duty, of the part she was expected to play. He would be firm, resolute. He was a king, and she was his subject, treaty or no. She would listen. She would obey. He would put an end to this silent, childish rebellion. He strode from the map room, his purpose clear, the force of his will a palpable aura around him. He would restore order. He did not consider, for a moment, that the order he sought to restore had already been irrevocably broken. 3 days. For 3 days, the silence from Ilara's chambers was absolute. Meals left outside her door were taken in, the trays returned empty, but the woman herself remained unseen. The whispers in the court grew from a murmur to a low roar. Factions who had opposed the treaty saw it as a sign of failure, a portent of doom. Those who supported it grew anxious, fearing the alliance was already crumbling. Ilara's absence had become a vacuum, and the politics of the Onyx Keep, which abhorred a vacuum, rushed in to fill it. Kalen felt the pressure mounting. It was an unfamiliar sensation. He was the absolute authority in his domain, his will was law. Yet he could not compel this one human to leave her room. He could break down the door, drag her out into the hall, and force her into a chair at his table. The thought was a brief, satisfying flash of violence, but he dismissed it instantly. That would be a catastrophic admission of failure. It would prove Valerus's point, that she was a prisoner, that the peace was a sham. No, this required a different kind of force. On the evening of the 3rd day, he went to her. He did not send a servant or a guard. He went himself. His footsteps were silent on the stone floors of the upper corridor. He felt the eyes of the portraits on him, their painted gazes seeming to hold a new, questioning quality. He reached her door and stood before it for a long moment, listening. There was no sound from within. He knocked. The sound was sharp, authoritative, a command in itself. Ilara. Silence. He could hear the crackle of her fire, the faint rustle of a turning page. She was there. She was ignoring him. Open this door. His voice was low, threaded with steel. It was the voice he used on the battlefield, the voice that had cowed rebellious lords and sent armies fleeing. A long pause, then the soft sound of a lock being turned. The heavy door swung inward, but only by a few inches. She stood in the gap, a slim shadow against the firelight behind her. She was not dressed in the fine gowns the court provided, but in a simple, high-necked woolen dress of her own, the color of moss. Her hair was pulled back, her face pale and composed. She looked calm. It was not the reaction he had anticipated. He had expected tears, fear, a sullen defiance. He saw none of it. "Your Majesty," she said, her voice quiet and even. There was no tremor in it. No deference, but no insolence either. It was simply a statement of fact. He found himself momentarily at a loss. He had come prepared for a confrontation, for an emotional outburst he could dominate and subdue. This placid stillness was disarming. "You have been unwell," he stated. It was not a question. "I have been resting," she replied, her gaze steady. Her eyes, he noticed, were not simply brown. They were the color of rich earth after a rain, flecked with gold. It was a detail he had not registered before. "Your period of rest is over," he said, his tone hardening. He was recovering his footing. "Your absence has been noted. It is causing complications. You will resume your duties tomorrow. You will attend the evening meal." She did not immediately agree. She simply watched him, her expression unreadable. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken things. He could feel the weight of his words from the balcony hanging in the small space between them. Did she know? Had she heard? The thought, which he had dismissed, now returned with an unwelcome prickle of uncertainty. "Is that a request, Your Majesty?" she asked finally, her voice still unnervingly quiet. The question stunned him. A request? He did not make requests. He gave orders. The sheer audacity of it, the quiet challenge couched in polite language, sent a jolt of anger through him. His eyes narrowed. It is a command. He expected her to flinch, to bow her head in submission. She did not. A flicker of something, disappointment, perhaps, moved in the depths of her earthy eyes. It was there and gone in an instant. "Then I must, of course, obey," she said. But the words were hollow. They were the assent of a prisoner, not the willing agreement of an ally. She had conceded the battle of wills, but in a way that made it feel like his loss. If that is all. She was dismissing him. A common human girl was dismissing the vampire king from her doorway. For 1,000 years, no one had dared. He felt an unfamiliar heat rise in his chest, a confusing mixture of fury and something else. Something he refused to name. "That is all," he bit out, the words tasting like ash. She gave a slight, formal nod. "Good night, Your Majesty." And she closed the door in his face. The soft click of the lock sliding back into place was as loud as a thunderclap in the silent corridor. Kaelan stood there for a full minute, staring at the unyielding oak. He had won. He had gotten what he came for. She would appear tomorrow. Order would be restored. So why did he feel as if he had been utterly and completely defeated? He turned and walked away, the echo of his silent footsteps chasing him down the hall. He was the king. He was in control. But as he retreated, he could not shake the image of her calm, steady eyes, or the profound, unsettling feeling that he had just lost a war he hadn't even known he was fighting. The next days fell into a strange, new pattern. Alara's isolation was no longer absolute, but it was still a fortress. She kept her word. She appeared at the evening meal, a silent, composed figure at the long, polished table. She wore the simple, dark gowns of her homeland, eschewing the silks and velvets of the court. She ate little, spoke only when spoken to, and answered in quiet, polite monosyllables. Her presence was a masterpiece of passive resistance. She was there, as he had commanded, but she was not with them. She was a ghost at the feast, her stillness a rebuke, her quiet dignity a shield he could not seem to penetrate. Kaelan found himself watching her. It was an unconscious habit at first, a king surveying his court, but it quickly became something more focused. He watched the way she held her silver goblet, her fingers long and graceful. He watched the way her eyes would occasionally drift to the high, stained glass windows, her expression unreadable. He noticed the small, worn book of poetry she sometimes brought with her, resting it in her lap beneath the table as if for comfort. These were small, human details, the kind he had trained himself to ignore for centuries. Now, they were all he could see. His court noticed his attention. Valerus's knowing smirks became more frequent. Serafina's observations grew more pointed. "The little mouse has captivated the lion," she murmured to him one evening, as Alara rose to excuse herself the very moment the meal was officially concluded. Kaelan's glare was thunderous, but he could not deny the truth in her words. He was captivated, but not by affection. He was captivated by a puzzle he could not solve. Why did her quiet defiance infuriate him so? Why did her sadness, which she guarded so fiercely, feel like a personal affront? He began to make inquiries. Discreetly, at first. He spoke to the human servant, the trembling woman who attended to Alara. He learned of her life before the keep, a life in a small, northern town, where her father was a scholar and a cartographer. He learned she had been raised on books, not on courtly intrigue. He learned that her favorite flower was the queen of the night, a rare cactus blossom that bloomed for a single night and withered by dawn. The details were mundane, common. And yet, they began to paint a picture of a person, not a political pawn. A woman who loved transient beauty and forgotten maps. The more he learned, the more the memory of his words on the balcony began to fester. Common blood. An embarrassment. He had spoken them to assert his power, to manage the prejudices of his court. He had not considered the truth of them. Was she common? Her lineage was not noble, it was true. But she possessed a composure, a quiet strength, that he had rarely seen in the high-born ladies of his own kind, who mistook hysterics for passion and cruelty for wit. And embarrassment. The embarrassment, he was slowly, unwillingly beginning to realize, was his own. He was shamed by his inability to command her respect, shamed by the petty cruelty of his words, shamed by the dawning awareness that he had grievously misjudged her. This realization was a bitter pill. He was Kaelan. He did not make mistakes. His judgments were absolute, his perceptions infallible. To admit error, even to himself, was to crack the very foundation of his being. And so he fought it. He doubled down on his imperious demeanor, his voice sharper in council, his presence more intimidating than ever. He tried to force the court, and himself, to forget the quiet girl at the end of the table. But her absence had carved out a space that her presence now defined. The court had expected a simpering, frightened creature, eager to please. Instead, they had a woman of quiet, unshakable dignity. She was becoming a legend in the whispers of the servants, both human and vampire. The common girl who was not cowed by the king. Her refusal to be broken was, in itself, an act of power. And power, in the Onyx Keep, was a thing to be respected. The balance was shifting, slowly, imperceptibly, like the turning of a continent. Ilara was no longer just a symbol of peace for the humans. She was becoming a symbol of something else entirely within the vampire court, the quiet, indomitable strength of the things they had forgotten to value. And Kaelin, the architect of her humiliation, found himself haunted by her, not by her sorrow, but by her strength. The empty space she had occupied in his mind, once labeled inconvenience, was slowly being filled by a name, Ilara. Fury was a familiar state for Kaelin. It was a cold, clean fire that sharpened his senses and clarified his will. But the emotion that roiled in him now was different. It was a murky, frustrating heat, a blend of anger, shame, and a profound, irritating confusion. His command had been obeyed, yet he had been defied. Ilara was present, yet absent. He, the king, had been rendered impotent by a girl's silence. It was intolerable. He needed to break the stalemate. His usual tools, fear, authority, overwhelming force, were useless against her placid composure. He had to try a different approach. A gesture. A gift. It was a tactic of manipulation, a way to indebt the recipient, to force a reaction. He would demonstrate his magnanimity, and in return, she would be obligated to offer gratitude, to soften, to yield. He commanded a chest of jewels to be brought from the royal treasury. Sapphires the color of the midnight sky, emeralds like captured forest light, diamonds that burned with cold fire. He selected a necklace, a heavy, ornate piece of exquisite craftsmanship, a king's ransom in a single object. It was a display of power, of wealth. It was impersonal, a statement of her value to the throne, not to him. He sent it to her chambers via a page, along with a simple, formal note, a token of the crown's esteem. He waited. He presided over the afternoon's court session, his focus fractured, his ear tuned for the report of the page's return. He imagined her reaction, awe, gratitude, perhaps even the beginning of a thaw. She would wear it to the evening meal, a silent admission of his generosity, a surrender. The page returned near dusk. He carried the velvet box in his hands. Kaelin's eyes narrowed. She returned it. "Your Majesty," the boy stammered, his face pale. She said nothing. Kaelin's voice was dangerously quiet. "Only, my compliments to His Majesty, but I have no need of such things," and she gave it back to me. A wave of cold fury washed through Kaelin. The audacity. The sheer, unmitigated insolence. To refuse a gift from the king was an insult of the highest order. He wanted to storm to her chambers, to break down the door and see the fear in her eyes he had so far failed to conjure. But he held himself in check. An outburst would be a victory for her. It would prove he was affected, that her quiet rebellion was working. He dismissed the page with a wave of his hand and stood for a long time at the window of his solar, looking out over the jagged peaks of the mountains that surrounded his fortress. The setting sun bled across the horizon, and the anger in him slowly, grudgingly, gave way to a sliver of something else. Respect. It was a foreign, unwelcome feeling, but it was there. She could not be bought. She could not be intimidated. He had miscalculated again. He had offered power, and she had rejected it. He had tried to treat her like the court women he knew, who would trade their souls for such a bauble. He had not treated her like Ilara. The name echoed in his mind. Ilara. A scholar's daughter. A lover of books and maps. He remembered the information gleaned from her servant, the detail he had dismissed as trivial. Her favorite flower is the queen of the night. A new idea began to form, a more subtle, more difficult strategy. This would not be a display of power. It would be a display of attention. It would be a gesture that said, "I see you." The queen of the night cactus was exceedingly rare in these cold, high altitudes. They required specific conditions, a delicate balance of light and soil that was nearly impossible to maintain in the keep's cavernous greenhouses. But Kaelin was king. His resources were limitless. He summoned his head gardener, a vampire ancient enough to remember when the mountains were young. "I require a queen of the night," Kaelan said, without preamble. "One that is about to bloom." The gardener's eyebrows, which were thick and grey as lichen, rose in surprise. "Your Majesty, that is difficult. We have only 3 specimens. They are temperamental. We cannot predict their blooming with certainty." "Try," Kaelan commanded. "Search every greenhouse. I want the flower. Tonight." A quiet, frantic search of the castle's vast botanical collections ensued. Hours passed. The moon rose, full and white, flooding the castle grounds with ethereal light. Kaelan waited in his solar, the rejected jewel box sitting on his desk like a rebuke. He found himself pacing, a restless energy he had not felt in centuries thrumming through him. He was investing an absurd amount of effort into this one small gesture. The irrationality of it was not lost on him. Finally, near midnight, the head gardener returned. He carried a single, gnarled pot. From it grew a flat, ugly cactus stem, and on that stem was a single, large, tightly closed bud. "It will bloom tonight, Your Majesty," the gardener said, a note of weary triumph in his voice. "Within the hour. It is the only 1 inch." Kaelan took the pot. The earthenware was cool against his hands. He looked at the unprepossessing plant, at the promise of a single, fleeting night of beauty. It was a fragile, transient thing. Like her. He did not send a servant. He carried it to her chambers himself. He knocked, and when she opened the door that now familiar few inches, he did not speak. He simply held out the pot. Ilara's eyes fell to the cactus. She saw the bud, swollen and pale in the moonlight from the corridor window. Her breath hitched. It was a tiny sound, but in the silence, it was as loud as a shout. Her gaze lifted to his, and for the first time, the calm, guarded mask fell away. He saw a flicker of profound, unshielded surprise. He saw the wall around her heart crack. She reached out and took the pot from him, her fingers brushing his for a fraction of a second. Her touch was warm. Impossibly, shockingly warm. "It is said to bloom only once," he said, his voice softer than he had intended. She didn't answer. She just stared at the flower, her knuckles white where she gripped the pot. He had finally forced a reaction from her. But it was not the one he had sought. It was not gratitude owed to a king. It was the quiet, astonished recognition of a deeply personal gift. It was a connection, and it terrified him more than her defiance ever had. He turned and left before she could say a word, the ghost of her warmth lingering on his cold skin. Ilara did not emerge from her chambers the next day. The court buzzed with speculation. The king's gift of jewels had been refused, that much was common gossip, and now she was in seclusion once more. It was seen as the final act of defiance, the definitive severing of ties. Valerus wore a triumphant smirk, certain the alliance was about to implode. But Kaelan knew better. He had felt the shift in the air between them, seen the crack in her formidable armor. Her retreat this time was not an act of defiance. It was something else. He did not know what, and the not knowing was a constant, low-grade irritant. He found his thoughts drifting to her throughout the day, wondering if the flower had bloomed, wondering what she had thought as she watched it. This preoccupation with the human girl was becoming a dangerous distraction. Late in the afternoon, a page brought him a small, folded piece of parchment. It was sealed not with wax, but simply tucked. His name, Kaelan, was written on the outside in a neat, precise hand. Not Your Majesty, just his name. He dismissed the page and broke the seal. The note inside was brief. It was beautiful. "Thank you." The words were simple, the ink a plain brown. Yet, as he read them, Kaelan felt a strange sense of victory. It was a quiet, private triumph, entirely different from the roar of a successful battle or the submission of a rival. She had not yielded, not truly. She had not bowed to his authority. She had responded to a gesture of understanding. She had met his attention with her own. For the first time, he felt a genuine desire to know her, not to manage her, not to control her, but to understand the mind that chose books over jewels, and the heart that could be touched by a single, fleeting flower. His shame, which had been a low, bitter ember, began to burn a little hotter. The embarrassment was not her commonness, but his own spectacular failure to see her. He had looked at a living, breathing woman and seen only a political chess piece. His arrogance had been monumental. He began to change his inquiries. He no longer asked his servants about her schedule or her compliance. He asked about the books she read. He went to the small, forgotten library himself, the air thick with the scent of dust and her faint, lingering presence. He saw the volumes she had disturbed, histories of his own lineage, books on the ancient languages of the North, collections of vampire folklore filled with monstrous caricatures of his kind. She was studying them. She was studying him. The realization was both unsettling and strangely flattering. He found himself thinking of her not as a problem to be solved, but as a person to be known. This shift in perspective was seismic. It altered the landscape of his world. For centuries, he had viewed humans as a homogeneous, ephemeral mass, livestock, enemies, or, at best, fragile and inconsequential allies. He had never allowed himself to see one as an individual, with a mind and a will and a history of her own. To do so was to open a door he had long kept barred, a door that led to empathy, to connection, to vulnerability. His shame began to transform. It was no longer just the private humiliation of being defied. It became a more profound, more personal regret. He, who prided himself on his perception, on his ability to see every angle of a situation, had been willfully blind. He had used his power not to lead, but to wound. And he had wounded a person who had done nothing to deserve it, a person who was now trying to understand the very culture that had casually dismissed her. The empty space at his table no longer felt like a political liability. It felt like a personal loss. He missed the quiet challenge in her eyes. He missed the silent, dignified rebuke of her presence. He found himself, to his own astonishment, wanting her to be there. Not as a symbol, not as a duty, but as a Lara. One evening, Valerus found him staring into the fire in the great hall long after the court had retired. "You are troubled, my king," the old vampire said, his voice a low drawl. "The human girl weighs on you." Kaelan did not look at him. He watched the flames consume a log, turning solid wood to ash and memory. "She is more resilient than I anticipated." "Resilience can be a virtue," Valerus said. "Or a fatal flaw. Do not mistake stubbornness for strength. She is still just a mortal." "Yes," Kaelan said softly, his eyes still on the fire. "She is," but the word, which he had once used as a dismissal, now sounded different in his own ears. It sounded like a miracle. That something so fragile could be so strong. That something so fleeting could possess a will of iron. His shame was no longer a secret he kept from himself. It was a truth he was beginning to accept. The shame of his words, the shame of his blindness, was becoming his own. And he knew, with a certainty that chilled him more than any winter wind, that he would have to face it. A week after she had received the flower, Kaelan knew he could not let the silence between them continue. Their fragile truce, built on a single bloom and a two-word note, was not enough. The court had settled into a wary acceptance of her quiet presence at meals, but the distance between them was a chasm. He had to close it. Not with commands or manipulations, but with something else. Something he was not practiced in. A conversation. He did not summon her. He went to her. He chose the late afternoon, the time he knew she often spent in her sanctuary, the small, circular library. He knocked on the main door to her chambers, and this time, it was her human maid who answered, her eyes wide with fear. "His Majesty," she breathed, dropping into a low curtsy. "Is your lady within?" he asked, his voice softer than usual. "In the library, sire." "Do not announce me." He moved through the opulent sitting room, his steps silent. The tapestry was pulled aside, and he stood in the arched doorway of the library, unobserved. The room was just as he had seen it before, but now it was animated by her presence. She was not sitting in the chair. She was on her knees on the floor, a massive, ancient atlas spread out before her. Her hair had come loose from its simple braid, and a few strands fell across her cheek as she leaned forward, her finger tracing a faded coastline on the parchment. The shaft of light from the high window illuminated the dust motes dancing around her and caught the gold flecks in her hair. She was completely absorbed, a scholar lost in her work. She looked peaceful, content. He watched her for a long moment, a strange ache in his chest. This was her world. A world of silence, and knowledge, and imagination. A world he had nearly shattered with his casual cruelty. He cleared his throat softly. She started, a gasp escaping her lips. She scrambled to her feet, turning to face him, her hand flying to her chest as if to still her racing heart. Her cheeks were flushed. "Your Majesty, I apologize for startling you," he said. And he meant it. She stared at him, her surprise evident. He had never apologized for anything. He gestured toward the atlas on the floor. "A map of the old world," he observed. "Before the sundering." She followed his gaze, her posture still tense. "The coastlines are different. I was trying to match them to modern charts." He stepped into the room. It felt like crossing a border into a foreign country. Her country. The air smelled of her, a faint, clean scent of soap and paper. "That one is inaccurate," he said, nodding toward the book. The cartographer, a man named Lyron, was notorious for his imagination. He drew islands where there was only open sea because he believed the world required more mystery. A small smile touched Ilara's lips, the first he had ever seen. It was a hesitant, fragile thing, but it transformed her face, softening the guarded lines around her eyes. "A romantic cartographer." "A terrible cartographer," Kaelin corrected, but there was no heat in his words. He found himself smiling back, a faint, unused expression that felt strange on his own face. "But a fine storyteller." The tension in the room lessened, fractionally. She did not retreat. She stood her ground, watching him with a new, questioning curiosity. The power dynamic, for a moment, was gone. He was not a king, and she was not his pawn. They were two people in a room full of books, talking about a long-dead, fanciful mapmaker. "You have been reading our histories," he said, gesturing to a stack of books on the small table beside the chair. She nodded, her gaze dropping for a second. "I thought it best to be informed." "And what have you learned?" he asked. The question was genuine. He wanted to know what she saw when she looked at his world, at his people, through the lens of their own chronicles. She hesitated, choosing her words with care. "I have learned that your history is long," she said finally, "and filled with as much sorrow as it is with glory. I have learned that you have lost as much as you have gained." Her perception was acute. She had not seen the power, the conquests, the centuries of dominance. She had seen the loss that underpinned it all. The loss of the sun, the loss of mortal life, the endless, grinding weight of immortality. She had seen the truth he lived with every day, a truth his own court preferred to ignore. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and saw not a common girl, but a woman of startling intelligence and empathy. A woman who had been insulted and isolated, and had responded not with malice, but with a quiet, determined effort to understand. In that moment, the last vestiges of his anger and frustration crumbled, leaving only the stark, cold weight of his shame. He had called this woman an embarrassment. The word echoed in the quiet library, a monument to his own blind arrogance. He felt the sudden, desperate need to confess, to excise the poison of that word from the space between them. But he could not. Not here. Not yet. The confession required a different setting, a different kind of courage. "The histories are often incomplete," he said, his voice strained. "They speak of kings and battles. They rarely speak of people." Her eyes met his, and in their earthy depths, he saw a flicker of understanding. She knew he was not just talking about the books. "Perhaps the most important histories are the ones that are never written down," she said softly. He held her gaze, a silent conversation passing between them. He had come here to command her, to force her back into the fold. Instead, he had found himself wanting to be invited into her world. The power had not just inverted, it had vanished, replaced by something far more complex and far more terrifying. A connection. He, who had walled his heart in ice for 1,000 years, felt the first, tentative crack. And through it, for the first time, a sliver of light shone in. The change in their dynamic did not go unnoticed. Kaelin began to seek her out. Not in public, not yet, but in the quiet moments of the day. He would find her in the library, and they would speak of history. He would find her walking the lonely upper battlements, and they would speak of the stars, which she was charting with a meticulousness that impressed him. Their conversations were careful, skirting the edge of the chasm that still lay between them, but they were conversations nonetheless. They were the slow, patient work of building a bridge. For Elara, it was a disorienting time. The king who had been the source of her deepest humiliation was now the only person in the keep who sought her out not as a symbol, but as a person. He listened to her. He asked for her opinions. He looked at her as if he were truly seeing her. The anger and hurt she had nurtured in her solitude began to feel heavy. It was a shield she was growing tired of carrying. But she could not simply set it aside. The wound was still there, a tender spot deep inside her. Kaelin felt it too. Every polite conversation, every shared observation about a book or a constellation, was shadowed by what remained unsaid. His words from the balcony were a ghost that haunted every interaction. He knew he could not build a bridge over a poisoned foundation. He had to drain the poison first. He had to confess. The thought terrified him. He was a king. Kings did not confess. They did not admit weakness. They did not apologize. To do so was to surrender power, to invite contempt. His entire existence had been a performance of unassailable strength. To show vulnerability was a kind of death. But the alternative, this stilted, careful dance around the truth, was becoming unbearable. Her quiet dignity was a constant mirror, reflecting his own Dishna back at him. Her effort to understand his world was a stark contrast to his own failure to even see hers. His shame was no longer a private burden, it was a debt that he owed her. A debt that had to be paid in the currency he valued least, his own pride. 3 weeks after he had given her the flower, he went to her chambers in the evening. She was not in the library. Her maid said she was in the sitting room, reading by the fire. He dismissed the maid and entered. Elara was curled in a large armchair, a blanket tucked around her, a book in her lap. The firelight softened the severe lines of the room and cast a warm glow on her face. She looked up as he entered, her expression wary but no longer hostile. "Your Majesty," she said, making to rise. "Please," he said, raising a hand. "Do not." He did not sit. He walked to the fireplace, resting one hand on the cool marble of the mantelpiece. He stared into the flames, gathering the courage he needed. "I have not been honest with you, Elara," he began, his voice low. The sound of her name on his own lips felt both intimate and foreign. She said nothing, simply watched him, her book forgotten in her lap. "The peace between our people is fragile," he continued, his gaze fixed on the fire. "It required a symbol. A gesture. You were chosen to be that gesture." He finally turned to look at her. "I saw you only as that. A symbol. A piece to be moved on a board. I did not see you." The air in the room grew thick, heavy with anticipation. Elara's hands tightened on her blanket. "There is something you must know," he said, and his voice was strained, the words fighting to get out. "On the night of the welcome feast, you were on the balcony. I was in the hall below, with my advisors." He saw the flicker in her eyes. The barest tightening of her jaw. She knew. Of course, she knew. She had known all along. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. Her entire withdrawal, her quiet defiance, her careful study of his people, all of it had been predicated on that one, brutal moment. And she had never once used it against him. The shame was now a physical thing, a crushing weight in his chest. "I spoke of you," he said, forcing the words out. I said your presence was an embarrassment." There. It was out. The ugly, shameful truth, laid bare in the quiet, firelit room. He expected her to flinch, to cry out, to finally unleash the anger and hurt she had so carefully contained. She did none of those things. She simply looked at him, her expression one of profound, weary sadness. She lowered her gaze to her hands, and when she spoke, her voice was a near whisper. "I heard. I know," he said, his own voice hoarse. "I realize that now. Elara, my words, they were born of arrogance. Of prejudice. They were a tool to manage my court, But that is no excuse. There is no excuse. It was a monstrous thing to say. A shameful thing. He took a breath, the confession tearing at the fabric of his pride. My shame is not that you are here. My shame is for what I said. For what I thought. Your absence, your silence, it taught me the depth of that shame. It held up a mirror, and I despised the king I saw. He stood before her, stripped of his crown, his power, his pride. He was just Kaelin, a creature of immense age and even more immense regret. He had offered her his truth, his vulnerability. He had given her the sword and bared his neck. He waited for the blow to fall. Ilara slowly raised her head. There were no tears in her eyes, but they shone with an unshed wetness. She looked at him, at the proud, ancient king who was now laid low by his own confession, and she saw not a monster, but a man. A man trapped by centuries of his own making. Why are you telling me this now? She asked, her voice soft but clear. Because, he said, and the truth of it was simple, and stark, and terrifying. Because I cannot bear the silence between us any longer. Because your good opinion, which I so carelessly threw away, has become something I find myself wanting to earn. It was the most honest thing he had said in 500 years. The admission hung in the air between them, fragile and luminous as a spider's thread in the dawn. It was not an apology, not in the simple sense. It was a confession. It was a plea. It was the beginning of a surrender. Ilara looked at him for a long, silent moment. The fire crackled in the hearth, the only sound in the room. She saw the cost of his words in the rigid line of his shoulders, in the deep, weary pain in his violet eyes. He had not tried to excuse his behavior. He had simply named it, and in doing so, had given her back the dignity he had tried to strip away. She did not offer him forgiveness. It was not hers to give, not yet. The wound was too deep to be healed with a single conversation. But what she could offer was something else. Something, perhaps, more valuable. She unfolded the blanket from her lap and set it aside. She stood up, smoothing the front of her simple dress. She was no longer a frightened girl in a cage. She was a woman who had faced down a king with nothing but her own integrity. Thank you for your honesty, Kaelin, she said. And in her voice, there was no anger, no bitterness. There was only a quiet, solemn acceptance. It was not forgiveness. It was understanding. And for Kaelin, who had lived for a millennium without ever truly being understood, it felt like a pardon. It felt like grace. The days that followed the king's confession were marked by a subtle but profound shift. The chasm between them had not vanished, but it was no longer a gaping wound. It was now a space they were consciously, carefully, trying to cross. Ilara began to emerge more from her self-imposed exile. She still took her meals in the great hall, but her presence was different. The shield of her silence was still there, but it was no longer an act of defiance. It was a habit of watchfulness, a quiet observation. Kaelin, for his part, made her a public and visible part of his daily routine. He would request her company for a walk along the castle's high, windswept ramparts in the thin light of dusk. He would ask her to join him in the map room, seeking her opinion on the layout of a human city or the historical name of a river. At first, the court watched these interactions with a mixture of shock and suspicion. Valerus and his faction saw it as a sign of the king's weakening, his mind bewitched by the common human. Others saw it as a calculated political move, a new strategy to solidify the alliance. No one, save Kaelin and Ilara themselves, understood that it was something far simpler and far more complex, a conversation. A long, slow, unfolding conversation that had begun in a dusty library and was now tentatively making its way into the world. One evening, he invited her to the Royal Observatory, a tall, isolated tower at the highest point of the Onyx Keep. The roof was a dome of enchanted glass that slid away to reveal the naked, star-dusted sky. A massive brass telescope, polished to a high gleam, dominated the circular room. Ilara stepped into the space with a soft gasp of awe. It's magnificent. It has not been used in 200 years, Kaelin said, his voice echoing slightly in the round chamber. My ancestors were astronomers. I found it, a lonely pursuit staring at the infinite, unchanging heavens only served to emphasize his own unending, unchanging existence. She moved toward the telescope, running a hand along its cool brass barrel. "May I?" He nodded. He watched as she adjusted the eyepiece, her movements deft and sure. She had a scholar's hands. She spent a long time looking, silent and absorbed. "What do you see?" he asked finally, moving to stand beside her. "A nebula," she whispered, her eye still pressed to the lens. "Where new stars are being born. It's a mess. Chaotic. But it's beautiful." He found himself looking not at the sky, but at her profile, illuminated by the faint, cold light of the distant stars. He saw the focused line of her brow, the soft curve of her lips. He had called her a glass of water next to aged wine. How blind he had been. She was not water. She was a world of quiet depths, hidden currents, and a capacity for growth he was only just beginning to comprehend. "I was wrong about you, Elara," he said, the words coming out more easily this time. "In every conceivable way." She pulled back from the telescope and turned to him. The starlight caught in her eyes, making them seem vast and deep. "You saw what you expected to see," she said. It was not an accusation, but a simple statement of fact. "It is what most people do. It is what I have done for 1,000 years, he admitted. "It is the privilege of power. To define others, and to never have to question that definition." He looked away from her, out at the sea of stars. "You have taken that privilege from me." "I took nothing," she said softly. "You gave it away. The night you brought me the flower." Their new beginning was not a grand pronouncement. It was a series of these quiet moments, of shared vulnerabilities and dawning recognitions. He learned the geography of her childhood from the stories she told. She learned the weight of his crown from the weariness in his eyes. The power dynamic that had once defined them had been dismantled, piece by piece, and in its place, something new was being built. It did not yet have a name. It was too fragile, too new. But it felt like hope. A month after her arrival, a delegation of human lords came to the Onyx Keep to assess the progress of the treaty. They were nervous, their eyes darting around the great hall, their hands resting close to the hilts of their swords. They had come to see if their offering had been accepted, if their princess was safe. Kaelin received them on his throne, the full weight of his ancient authority on display. But this time, there was a second, smaller, less ornate chair placed beside his own. A chair that had never been there before. When Elara entered the hall, a murmur went through the human delegation. She was not in chains. She was not pale and weeping. She wore a simple gown of deep forest green, her hair braided with silver ribbons. She moved with a quiet confidence that silenced the room. She was not a prisoner. She was not a victim. She looked regal. She walked to the dais, and Kaelin stood as she approached. This small gesture, this act of respect from the immortal king to the common girl, sent a shockwave through the court. Valerus's face was a mask of thunderous disbelief. Serafina watched with sharp, calculating eyes. Elara took her seat beside him. She did not look at him, but he could feel the warmth of her presence, a small, steady flame in the cold expanse of his life. The human lords, seeing her there healthy, poised, and seated in a place of honor beside the fearsome vampire king, visibly relaxed. The audience proceeded, a formal exchange of pleasantries and reassurances. But the true diplomacy was not in the words being spoken. It was in the image they presented, two worlds, sitting side by side, in a state of quiet, mutual respect. Later, after the delegation had been shown to their quarters, Elara and Kaelin stood on the same balcony where she had first overheard his devastating judgment. The night was cold, the air sharp and clean. "You have become an excellent diplomat," he said, his voice low. She looked out over the darkened courtyard. "I did nothing. I just sat in a chair." "You did everything," he corrected her. "You showed them that peace is possible not through submission, but through strength." He paused. "Your strength, Elara." She finally turned to look at him, and the last of the guardedness in her eyes seemed to melt away, replaced by a soft, hesitant warmth. "And you, Kaelin," she said. "You showed them a king can learn." In her eyes, he saw not just understanding, but the first glimmer of something more. The empty space her absence had created in his life, the shame that had filled it, was now being replaced by a new, terrifying, and exhilarating feeling. It was the feeling of being seen, truly seen, for the first time in centuries. He had called her common blood an embarrassment. But now, in the quiet communion of the night, he knew that her presence was the only thing that had ever made him feel truly noble. Her absence had been his shame. Her presence was becoming his salvation. He reached out, his cold fingers finding her warm ones on the stone railing, and for the first time, she did not pull away. Their hands rested together, a silent treaty far more powerful than the one that had brought her here. It was a new beginning, born from a wound, nurtured in silence, and now, finally, ready to step into the light.